Hey, beautiful soul. You're listening to the Rising into Mindful Motherhood podcast, your weekly dose of fertility wisdom. I'm your host, Dr. Katie Wood. I'm a barefoot mama bear, pharmacist, and integrative fertility coach. This is your go-to podcast for all things to naturally nourish your fertility, embody womb healing, and reclaim your feminine power to accelerate your path to pregnancy. My expert guests and I will be having intentional conversations to discuss the many facets of a thriving, fertile foundation, natural wellness, and how we grow and transform as women on our journey to motherhood. So let's dive in, shall we? Hello and welcome to Rising into Mindful Motherhood. Today I'll be talking with Dr. Aumatma. She is a double board certified naturopathic doctor and endocrinologist with close to 15 years of experience, and she is also a best-selling author of 2 books and the host of the Egg Meets Sperm podcast. Today we'll be discussing the top 3 misconceptions about fertility. And I just want to mention, I was first introduced to Dr. Aumatma as a speaker at a Temp Drop affiliate event, and she was just really speaking my language. I appreciated everything that she was sharing and in just the way that she supports her clients on their fertility journey. So it's an absolute pleasure to have her on the podcast today. So welcome. I'm so excited to have you.
Thank you so much for having me, Dr. Katie. It's good to be here and good to reconnect with you because you're just such a beacon of light, and for all of the amazing work that you're doing in the world. It's beautiful.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So we won't stay here too long, but I love hearing, where and why did this passion for fertility come in for you?
It actually, when I was in medical school, I was like, I want nothing to do with hormones. They're so complicated. I just leave me alone. And of course, those hormones followed me throughout my entire career.
Wow.
And I was already in practice at the time and married to this man who wanted to have a baby. And every time he would mention babies, my uterus would literally scream like, no. That was a moment for me to be like, do I not want to have children? Is it not with him? Is it not right now? Like, there were just so many questions that I took some time to, instead of like answering him, I just kept thinking about it. And I went down this like 9-month rabbit hole to try and figure out what about fertility, and could I think I realized pretty early on that discovery path that it was just that I didn't want to have babies with him. And so I was like, oh crap, and I'm almost 35 and that's what I know about fertility is going to drop off of a cliff. What am I going to do? So I really kind of started on that path with what can I do for myself. And what I quickly found was the 3 misconceptions that I call them, and that in the process of the discovery, the stuff that I was finding in research, I just started sharing it with people, and women were like, oh great, so you can help me get pregnant. And I was like, no, that's not what I want to do at all. And then finally, like, I had so many people asking me, I was like, okay, if we're going to do this, I will, A, I've never done it before. B, I'm like, all of my stuff is research, right? Like, it's none of it is clinical, like this actually works. And third, like, it's going to cost you, like, it's not going to be free, even though you would be my first client. So I told this woman this, and she was like, and I was like, and I don't want an answer right now. Like, go meditate on it. Tell me to, like, call me on Monday. And she came back on Monday morning and she was like, you're the weirdest doctor I've met, but I'm really clear that you can help me. And she got pregnant and had a baby. And of course, like, once you have one child and you just like hooked, I was like, oh my God, this is the best thing ever. So
Wow.
all the people from then on, I was like, yes, we can do this. And refined and learned so much in that process. That yeah, like now I can't imagine doing anything else, which is such a drastic change from where I started.
That's
Um,
amazing.
but yeah, thank you for letting me share that. I
Yeah,
know it's a long story.
I love that story. And I always like to like take a step back at the big picture and like what were the life lessons and the things that happened to get you here. So if you weren't married to that man and he didn't go down those rabbit holes, think about all those women that maybe wouldn't have had your help, because I know you've had astounding results. So it's just I always just love looking at those like little nuggets of like, oh
Yeah.
my gosh, if this didn't happen, like
Mhm.
where would you be? And just how that could have changed the trajectory of so many other things. So
Yeah. And it's sort of like the gifts that we find in the moments of hardship or in the moments of like, wait, I'm turning my whole life upside down. Which
yeah.
is what it felt like in the moment. But I'm like forever grateful, right? Like, thank God for the wrong relationship, the wrong person. My
Mm-hmm.
uterus just being like, God, no, don't do that. and for me to like take a pause and be like, what is it? Like, I could totally see myself just giving in and like, oh yeah, it's the next thing to do is have a child because you just got married. But when sometimes we have to like pause and like what is in alignment? Like what's the lesson? What's the gift? And where do we go? Um,
Yeah.
and yeah, I feel very blessed that I had that experience as hard as it was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's
Um,
another beautiful lesson to highlight is just it could have been so easy to like shut down and hush that intuition you had, like that something wasn't quite right. But
yeah.
you didn't and you paused. So very nice. Well, I'm dying to know these three misconceptions that you felt like you had to share with everyone. So
Yeah.
please do share with us. Let's dive in.
Yeah. Yeah. So the first misconception is probably the one that challenges all of our understanding of fertility, which is the fertility age thing.
Mhm.
Um, so what I found when I tracked all of the kind of guidance and research, and it tracked all the way back to the 1800s in France, not from science, but from churches that had documented that women over 35 did not bring children in to get baptized. So when I got to that point, I was like, what? Everything we're telling people is based on the 1800s in France? Like, why? How does that give us what we have today, which is, oh, your fertility is just going to drop off of a cliff? So then I went into researching, like, okay, so are we doing research actively on this now? And most of the research doesn't really exist because we have accepted this as science,
Mm.
even though it's not science. And we have been saying it and repeating it and teaching it and repeating it for so long that no one is questioning it. But I found a couple of very small studies. They're like, granted, they're small, but like 100, 200 people in different parts of Europe that they're basically comparing an average 25 to 29 year group versus a 35 to 39 year group.
Mm.
And they mostly are finding about a 3% difference in conception rates between the two groups,
Mhm.
which, like, when you think about fertility, you're like, what, a 3% drop? Like, that's not huge. It's
Mhm.
like, okay, 3%, like, I'm okay with that drop. But when we say a fertility cliff, it makes it sound like, oh, a 95% drop, which
Mhm.
is not true. So I think that because so much of fertility is founded on this idea that age is everything, and women go at 38, 39, 40, they can go to a fertility clinic, and the clinic is going to force them essentially, or like convince them that it's their age, the likelihood that IVF is going to be successful is a lot lower, and that IVF is really their only option. When in reality, like I feel like if women knew the difference, like, hey, 3 to 5% drop, if that's all the risk that I'm taking, I'm okay with that risk. um, and then it leads us to asking different questions. It leads us to maybe not being so stressed, like, oh, I'm 37, it's never going to happen for me. Instead of like, hey, I'm 37 and I want to like take that 3% loss or whatever, and instead do things that are going to help maximize my fertility now, even if I'm 37. So I feel like we could ask so many different questions, which is essentially the path that I went down, because for my own self, I was like, okay, so if there's only a 3% drop, then what do I need to do to like be okay to have a baby later in life? And I did. Luckily, my story is that I found my partner relatively soon after my divorce, and I ended up having a child like 7 years after that point.
Wow.
Very well into my late 30s. And and it was a very calculated risk, along with a calculated, like, what can I do now that is going to preserve my fertility within my body? Because I didn't have the money for egg freezing or anything like that at the time. And the research didn't support that either. So I was like, okay, well, I want to preserve my fertility. I'm very clear that I want a child with the right person whenever that time is. So I'm like, yeah, so that fertility myth of around age is, I think, the biggest one. And I think when we question that and we shift that mind state, we open to a whole new set of possibilities. And it's the hardest thing for me to like help women unlearn, because it's so ingrained. And every single woman that we work with over 35 is like stressed, like, oh my God, is this going to ever happen for me? And I'm like, it's okay. Just breathe. It's going to be okay. I promise it's going to be okay. Like, if you are here, if you're in our program, I'm really confident it's going to be okay for you.
Yeah.
And of course, no guarantees, but we have pretty good track record. So that's the first one. The second one is around IVF. And I think there's this myth or belief that, oh, I'm going to try for a little bit, and if it doesn't happen, I'm going to walk into a clinic and walk out with a baby. And it's this like feeling of instant gratification, when in reality, the science actually shows that fertility clinic rates of success are based on 6 consecutive cycles of IVF. So a woman goes in, or a couple goes in, they say, oh, I'm going to walk out with a baby. And then 3 cycles, 4 cycles in, they're like, crap, what's happening? Like, why am I still here? And the process is actually a lot longer than they anticipated. So I think there is this misconception or idea that, like, it's not so much doctors. I feel like it's more the media that's propagating this idea that, oh, you like, you're a celebrity, you're dealing with fertility, it doesn't matter how old you are, you're going to walk out with a baby. But they're not really showing what's happening under the surface. They're not showing the back end of that couple's journey. So it gives us a kind of, on a broad scale, this idea or this belief that, oh, it's just going to be instant, easy, faster, easier, when in reality, like, none of that is true. So that's the second. And then the third is a cultural misconception that I think is true in too many cultures around the world, which is that fertility is a female issue. And the reality is, 51% of fertility issues are female and 49 are male.
Mm-hmm.
And many, many, many of them are in overlap. So it's really like, it's what's hard for me is the number of couples that I've talked to that come to me and say, oh, why does my partner need to be here? First of all, right? And that's a requirement for us. You want to work with us, your partner's present from the very first time I connect with you. And they're like, but why? He works. He doesn't have time for this.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, well, if he doesn't have time for this, he doesn't have time for a child. So what's going on here? So it's really like, I think we have given women this burden almost of carrying this weight around, like, oh, if we're not having a child, it's my fault and I'm doing something wrong. When in fact, like, there are so many things that we can track back to males. There is so much data that is coming out around pregnancy outcomes and how it relates to blood sugar, insulin, homocysteine, methylation, like so many factors on the male side. So things that are testable in men in blood tests that are never tested, that actually directly relate to whether or not a woman is going to carry that child to term. So we have kind of a situation where we're maybe like not setting couples up for success because they go in thinking, oh, it's just going to be instant. It's her, it's not me. Mm-hmm. I've had guys say, oh, I had a child 18 years ago, so that's not me. I'm like, so if she had a child 18 years ago, is that the same? And they're like, no, because she's older. Like, yeah, so you're older too. It doesn't work that way, right? Like this belief, like sperm are forever there. Yes, they're forever present. That doesn't mean a 70-year-old male is going to have the same quality of sperm that he had at 30. So yeah, those are all the kind of belief systems that I question and get me really fired up because when we think about how deep these go, I was just talking to a couple this morning from Congo, and they're Congo, but they live in the US now. So the woman only speaks French, and he was like translating all of this, and he's like the sweetest guy, right? And they I was like asking them about stress in their life, and she said in French, well, aren't you stressed about the same things? And it seemed like the first time they were having this conversation. And he's like, no, I'm not stressed. I'm feeling optimistic that we have someone who can support us. And she's like, well, I'm worried and stressed. And she was like crying. And I was explaining to him, like, she has a different way of holding the fertility struggle because it's like so ingrained in us as women that we're going to bear children and we're going to grow these children and we're going to like support this child to become a healthy, good human being, right? It's always on the woman. And he was like, yeah, I totally get that. That's so true in our culture. Like, that's how, yeah, like the woman does all the stuff related to children. He's like, I'm only here because I have to translate. And I want to have a child, but I have to translate. So yeah, that I think that when we start to reframe how we have these conversations, even within ourselves or within a couple's conversations, the minute that she feels like he's equally holding responsibility, she can let go. She can give a little bit of that stress and burden away which is going to tremendously help her fertility.
Yeah. Yeah. And to your point, if they won't do their part on the fertility side, then what is it going to look like on the parenting side?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's something you need to look at,
Mm-hmm.
or you try to have a child together.
Yeah.
Really just make sure that you're on the same page, because I had worked with someone and her partner wanted to do nothing. And this was really when I decided, like, okay, I'm not doing that again. But yeah, you really just have to, I think that that's also an eye opener of how supportive will they be in your pregnancy. And as a parent, how much are they willing to contribute? And it is hard because like you were saying, it's just been ingrained in us that that's what we were built for. Our bodies were built to have babies, and like we hold all of the answers for that, but really it takes two to make a child, and
Mm-hmm.
50% of that equation is the male. So, requiring them to be in good health is just as important.
Yeah. 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 And if we could just like pay attention to that from the beginning, and the number of men after they have started working with us, they're like, oh my God, I didn't realize like how much I felt like not a part of this journey,
Yeah.
because no one was expecting anything except for giving the sperm donations every single month, They're like, this is so much better because I feel like I'm contributing and I'm an equal partner,
Mm-hmm.
and that I'm important, I'm cared for, I'm showing up just as much as she is.
Mm-hmm.
And then the female is like, oh, this is awesome. I don't have to tell him that he needs to take his supplements and what to eat and to stop drinking. Like he's just doing all of these things.
Mm-hmm.
Is so great, right? So
Yeah,
yeah,
that's
yeah.
nice. And I think that's something that they'll be able to take with them in their future,
Mm-hmm.
during the pregnancy, during labor, because I know that that's another part when men can feel a little excluded and like they don't know what to do, they don't know how to help. And to be able to cultivate that like deeper connection amongst themselves is
Yeah.
really, really amazing. I remember when we were trying for our first, I couldn't get my husband to take even zinc or vitamin C. And
Mhm.
we're considering a second in the future. And I'm like, this is going to be very different this time. I know a lot more now than I did then.
You're like, you better get on board.
Yeah. And then to go back to the first one, I did not know about it tracking back to like the 1800s in the church. I mean, I'm not surprised at all. Um, but yeah, that's so wild. And it is a really hard belief to shift for so many women. And I even have like 30-year-olds coming to me frantic because they're like, I'm 30. I'm going to be 35 soon. It's like, it's okay. It'll be absolutely okay. And it kind of like what you did when you realized like, oh, I'm not in a situation right now where I want to have a child. So what can I do to make sure that I'm preserving my fertility and my health? And if only we could be more like proactive with that mindset instead of reactive due to our age and everything.
Hmm. Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. And there's so much we can do.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like we have a lot of power on the fertility journey that we don't realize we have, so we give it away.
Yeah.
Right? Or it's taken and we don't ever question it because it's like, oh, I didn't have that power to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but once we start realizing like, oh, all of this actually makes a difference. I have seen a number of fertility clinics, doctors telling women that their diet makes no difference.
Mm-hmm.
None, no difference whatsoever Whereas there are studies that have tested this with very large numbers of women and come out with a very different belief, which
Yeah.
is actually diet is a really big component of whether or not your IVF cycle will work, whether or not you will get pregnant at 37.
Mm-hmm.
So those, like the low-hanging fruit in terms of preserving what has been given to us. And we can't control how many eggs we got, we can't control our genetics, but knowing these things can really set us up to have a different outcome because we can prepare and we can plan in a way that supports the life goal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And one of the things I'd love to touch on, and you talked about this at the affiliate event, is the restorative fertility model. I think
Mm-hmm.
you had like the 4 R's, and I really love that. So would you
Yeah.
like kind of speak to that a little bit?
Sure, yeah. So restorative fertility, that word for me is recognizing that we're only like giving back or supporting and optimizing what's already there.
Mm-hmm.
So it I've had this like issue with the word infertility for a long time, and it just put such a like a negative spin on the fertility struggles that people have. But it's never infertility. It's almost never infertility. I shouldn't say never. But outside of a few genetic disorders or a few physical abnormalities that make it hard for someone to conceive and they probably will not have a child, outside of that, there's a lot of gray.
Mm-hmm.
And all of that gray is usually what people are being labeled as infertile. So that's the first. The second is let's restore what's out of balance. Let's restore it to balance. Let's restore it to harmony. And for us, that is a 4-step process: reveal, remove, rebalance, and receive. So reveal is the phase in which we're looking under the hood of like, let's peek under there and see what's happening. Um, and we want to look at a variety of factors that could be contributing or lowering the chances of someone being able to get pregnant or stay pregnant. We work with a lot of miscarriage or pregnancy loss women. So reveal, and then remove is getting rid of all the things in our environment as far as toxins and things like that. Getting rid of internal toxins, as well as getting rid of mindsets that keep us stuck where we are. So that's phase 2. And then rebalance is the phase where we are bringing harmony. So if we figured out, oh, these hormones are not connecting and responding the way that they should, then let's support those to do what they're designed to do. And then within that, we might find, oh, gut microbiome is not optimal. And that's why the hormones are not working. So then we have to do that piece. Or when we say hormones, most people think fertility hormones, but we're also talking about the thyroid and the adrenals and all like pituitary hormones. There's so many different hormones that make up the soup in our body that actually is either signaling pro-fertility or anti-fertility. And it's a spectrum. So if we're closer to pro-fertility, then it's easier to conceive. And if we're closer to anti-fertility, then it's harder to conceive. So having that or finding that balance, and then receive is the state where we're able to be in the in the energetic and mental emotional space to like open our hands and receive the gift rather than this idea of like, oh, we're making a baby, right? Like even the wording.
Yeah.
So in my first book is called Fertility Secrets, Why Your Doctor Didn't Tell You About Baby Making. And every time I wanted to call it baby receiving, and the publishers were like, absolutely not. Call it baby making. That's what people know. And I'm like, I get it, but it's really not. Like, we're not making a child. We're just opening to actually receive what can happen there. So yeah. So those are the 4 steps. And the receive phase, the easiest way I would describe it, because a lot of people are talking about stress and how it affects fertility. So I describe it as going from that like fight or flight state where stress is heightened and body is getting the signal of like it's not safe to have a child, and then moving into a more safety and surrender space where it's easy to let go. It's easy to, or easier, I should say, to trust our bodies and know that our bodies are doing what they're designed to do.
Mm-hmm.
And we can surrender to that. And we feel like we're in a safe place, physically, emotionally, mentally, all the things, for a child to come into our lives.
Yeah. I think it's a beautiful breakdown, and putting it into like the 4 R's. I think it makes it more digestible and less overwhelming. And I love that you incorporate like the mindset, the inner beliefs, and like the energetics, because I think that that's a huge piece that's missing, because conventional medicine, fertility clinics, they're definitely not talking about that for sure. But, and definitely not doctors, but it's a very, very important piece to the whole puzzle. So I love that you spoke on that. And I'm definitely going to link both of your books in the show notes, and I'm going to order them myself. I did not know that you wrote 2 books. So when I was reading that in your bio,
Well, the
my God, I need to get these.
the second one is actually a collection, so it's not just me.
Oh, okay.
Um, but it's a collective book from a lot of leaders in the fertility space.
Mm.
And we share kind of a big picture perspective and like stories, and makes it very relatable for people to kind of like put their mind around and like reframe
Yeah.
fertility.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Right.
So good. They're great. I feel like both of them are great. But there is I just got a message from someone, and I love reading these messages because I don't always know. Like when you put a book out into the world, it's kind of like it's just there. Anybody could buy it, anybody. And it was really scary to birth that book. Um, but um the the message was like, I got this book. I don't know why I was called to it. I was just called to it. It felt like the right thing. I followed all the advice. I got pregnant. And I was like, whoa, that's so cool. I don't know who this person is. It was just like a random message.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that it can impact way more people, the people that I will never meet or see or hear from. But it's out there and it's doing something for people. So I
Yeah.
love that.
Yeah, that's awesome. And speaking of books, so I know you included a freebie,
Mm.
which has to do with a book, I think. Um,
It's a ebook, I believe.
yeah.
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 Do you want to share about that at all?
We have a lot of resources for people. Um, the there are a few that I think would be really helpful.
Uh-huh.
So if we didn't send it to you, we can share that link. The one that comes to mind based on what we just talked about is called the blueprint. And it is essentially goes through several case studies of what we did with people to help them get pregnant. And it goes through the 4-step process. It's like, okay, in this phase, we found this stuff, right? So it really breaks it down to helping people that are maybe in a similar space that are like, I don't know, how do I do this? Why am I stuck? Why is this not working? To have some guidance. And what we hear back is that that one is really helpful in helping people see that if they're struggling with these things, then something that is more holistic could actually help them.
Yeah.
So that's that. If we didn't share the blueprint, I think that's a really good one.
Okay.
And then the other is a lab test cheat sheet, because that's probably the biggest question that I get is, what do I do with these hormones? Are my hormones optimal? Why can't I get pregnant? So at least we can, I put that together with the intention of like, you can get your labs done, or you probably have your labs already. You can look at it and say, are these optimal or not? And optimal is different from what the lab says is normal. So your doctor only flags it when it's abnormal or it's out of the lab range. But with hormones, the ranges are so broad that it puts people at a disadvantage, because like, oh, it came out as normal, but normal for estrogen, even, for example, is like the upper limit on estrogen is 300, I think. I don't remember off the top of my head, but it's really, really high. If your estrogen is actually 300 on cycle day 3, that would be so bad for fertility. Like extremely not optimal. So something like that, we want to be ahead of it, rather than being told, oh, your hormones are normal, so you should do IVF. And potentially IVF could work in those situations. But if we also got our hormones optimized, that could probably also work. So yeah, the cheat sheet I think is really helpful, just to have a one page of like, what do I need to know about my hormones? Are these in range or out of range? And then that gives people a sense of what to do to like get guidance on where to go next.
Yeah, very cool. Thank you. And I'd love for you to just share a little bit about your podcast and where the listeners could connect with you and follow you and all that.
Yeah, thank you for reminding me. When people say, where can they find you? I'm like, Instagram. But our podcast is called Egg Meets Sperm. Yes, that has been a joy to create. And we're finally seeing like the people that are like, oh, I heard your podcast and it's so amazing. And I've like binged on all the episodes. And I'm like, great, awesome. Like, so much coming in that it's great. And then Instagram is the other place. So at Holistic Fertility Doctor, and we share lots of info and just education there as well. And then the book would be the third. So Fertility Secrets, what your doctor didn't tell you about baby making.
Awesome. I will link everything in the show notes for sure. And thank you so much for just taking the time to be here today and just share your expertise and knowledge and passion with us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for tuning in to the Rising into Mindful Motherhood podcast. If this episode resonated with you or gave you an aha moment, stop what you're doing right now and write a review. This simple act of kindness helps me get this podcast out to connect with as many women as I possibly can. I also have a special offer. If you send me a screenshot of your review, I will take $250 off one of my premium coaching containers. Let me know what resonated with you the most and why. So connect with me in my free Facebook community or tag me on Instagram. You'll find both listed below. Thanks again from the bottom of my heart for tuning in to this episode, and I'll see you next time.